This meeting is being recorded.
Didn't ask me where I want it recorded, but hopefully it'll be on the computer. Anyway, welcome everyone to this month's meeting of the Nashville Microsoft Azure User Group. I normally do a 10-minute introduction to the group, but I'm going to spare you that tonight so we can get right into Tim's presentation. Visit the meetup group, and you can see an about page, and you can find out more about the group itself. And with that, I'm going to turn control over to Tim. Although I always start off by saying Tim is someone who needs no introduction. That's pretty true. Tim is very well known in the Azure community. He's created a lot of videos for Pluralsight and other companies, and really he currently joined the mothership, joined Microsoft, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more about his background. So again, Tim, you want to take it away?
Yep, sure will, Bill. Thanks very much. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks again for being here. This is about Microsoft Azure trends for 2023. As Bill said, I am a tech trainer. I also work for Microsoft full-time. I've been with them a little under a year now. And I work in what's called the skilling organization, which really turns into Docs and the MS Learn, all the training content. And because I'm a trainer, I'm slowly transitioning from the conceptual docs into training, because that's what I love. That's my professional passion. So I figure, let's see, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, so I've got 6:03 p.m. Central Time. I normally go for an hour, including questions, but I'll hang out afterwards, especially if you have lots of questions and comments and concerns. What I have for you tonight, as the title would let you know, I think, are what are some big picture trends that I've observed in my working with Azure every day. To date, I've been with Azure since the beginning, back in the Service Management API before the ARM API came in. But specifically, how does that trajectory feed into what we've got going on now in 2023? Now, two caveats really. One is that I'm speaking for myself. I'm not here on behalf of my employer. This is something that I just love to do and have done for a number of years. I love the Microsoft tech community. So this is just one person's unfiltered viewpoint. The other point, well, I guess that's it. Let's just say one point. Now, the rationale that I'm using, like I said, is I'm looking at big picture trends. We are going to look at specific Azure services. But when I think of the big picture, I mean, what does Azure have as far as resource providers, the actual services? I believe there's over 300 now. Maybe that's including ones that are still in preview, but we're talking about a lot of products. I'm thinking of ones that span as many of those resource providers as possible. So I'm thinking of Azure trends and services that are fairly universal, not just within Azure, but also hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. Again, my audio is doing its thing again. Hang on just a second. Let me unplug my microphone.
Okay, you sound okay.
Do I still sound okay?
Yeah, you sound fine, right?
Okay, good. All right, anyway. So cross-service, universal, and also embraced by the Microsoft tech community. It's really cool to see certain Azure services just take off. Bicep, the domain-specific language used for Azure deployments, definitely is one of those that it seemed to spring up out of nowhere. And then the uptake was so fast that it caused Microsoft to do a fair bit of scrambling. And we're still scrambling now from a docs perspective, making sure that all of our code examples, particularly the ARM template reference, includes not just the JSON, which is what you would expect, but also Bicep and also Terraform. That's something else we could discuss if you want. And lastly, these are trends in Azure that address current 21st century problems and needs. Think of application architecture trends like microservices, containers. Think of private access. How do we securely access our data and applications using the Azure public cloud on the internet, but we still are able to do, as much confidentiality as we possibly can, that kind of stuff. Now, the session materials, all I have for you is this slide deck, but if you want it, you're welcome to have a copy. You can point your browser to timw.info AZ trends, and that will take you to a PDF download. It's just a direct download. It probably will load right in your browser. I created a PDF of this slide deck. So that's your takeaway. I hope that you find it helpful as a reference. So with that, why don't we get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation together? I wanted to start by putting all the trends on one slide that I've identified, and then we'll go into each one individually. I don't know about you, but I have a pet peeve when I click into a news article and the reporter is doing clickbait stuff to try to get you on the page, and it turns out to be nothing, just garbage. Or they bury the main point at the bottom to get you scrolling. Oh, that really drives me nuts. So let's not do that. Let me not bury the lead. So we're going to discuss private endpoint and what it brings to the table. Azure policy, that's really the heart of the Azure governance strategy. Azure Arc, again, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud focus. The Microsoft Artificial Intelligence Services, particularly Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI. Microsoft Deployment Services and trends that you definitely should know about. Beyond Bicep, I've got some good info that you might not know about regarding Microsoft deployment. Now, actually, I just remembered the second caveat that I was going to mention earlier. I technically forgot it, but now I remembered it. Of course, I can't disclose, and I won't disclose any NDA protected information as a Microsoft employee, but anything that's in the public domain, I've cleared it with the appropriate engineering teams. So I hope that you'll get some extra benefit from that. And then lastly, hybrid cloud identity and single sign-on. So that's the big picture of what I've seen, particularly over the last handful of years, and definitely front and center now that we're in 2023 going forward. So if nothing else, I want to make sure that you leave this session with a nice conversational familiarity of all 6 of those trends. And like I said, I'm here live to answer your questions. If you want to go deeper with any of those, I'm prepared to do a demo. Whatever you want to know. So let's get into each one specifically now. First, what's this private endpoint stuff? What I've done for each of these trends is started with just a representative user story. For instance, how can we access our Azure-based data privately without going over the public internet, I mean, when we think about the Azure Commercial Cloud, it's by definition a multi-tenant environment, and all of your resources, including databases, storage accounts, etc., have an internet accessible URI. Scary. Well, if you need air-gapped private access, you could pay for an Azure Stack appliance, but that's going to involve, well, it's really kicking it old school, isn't it, in some ways, in terms of having to maintain on-premises hardware with associated maintenance and energy consumption and all of that stuff. If you've worked with App Service, for instance, the hosted web and API service in Azure, there is still, to this day, an option called the App Service Plan, where you can have, again, single tenant environment for your Azure web apps and APIs, but you're going to pay a lot of money. The prices come down on that over the years, but that's still very expensive because you're requesting that Microsoft provision hardware and other resources specifically for you. This is why I think private endpoint is so important a trend, because it gives you that privacy of being able to interact with Azure data services off internet using private non-internet routable IP addresses without the cost. In fact, if you do a search at azure.com, I don't even think private endpoint has a cost itself. Maybe normally for data egress, when you're doing downloads and transfers, there's cost implications to that. That's chargeable, but the service itself. So what I've done here, rather than fill up slides with words that you can find in the MS Docs, let's face it, I just grabbed a representative architectural diagram from the Azure Architecture Center. And as you see in the lower left corner of each slide, I placed an attribution URL if you want to go to that page where I sourced the image. So what are we looking at here? Well, let me bring my drawing tools out first of all. So it looks like in this example, we want to interact with a storage account So just the sky's the limit. Think of, you've got a cloud-based application that's reading and writing to the various services, and let's just say blobs, the blob service. So you've got confidential proprietary data in that storage account. Because we're in the Azure Commercial Cloud, you normally go over the internet. As you can see, my storage with pl.blob.core.windows.net. Now, the way that the engineers created private endpoint is that you don't have to change any of your connection strings to work with the private endpoint. You connect using that public DNS name, but due to how private endpoint works, you wind up doing a private connection. How do you get a private non-internet routable IP address over the internet? That's the challenge. Well, this one, a common in a hybrid cloud scenario, I hope that you would have, for instance, a site-to-site virtual private network, or in this topology, it's an express route circuit. That's going to give you your layer 3 connectivity to where you can communicate from your on-premises environment into your Azure VNet infrastructure using private IP addresses. So in this example, in one of the spoke virtual networks, we've got a private endpoint created for the blob service of that storage account. When you create a private endpoint, Azure will actually create a software network interface card, land it on that subnet, and then you get a private IP address just as if the private endpoint were a virtual machine. Now, the trick to private endpoint is how do you resolve that private IP address? Now, we don't have the time to do a full workup, but long story short is it relies on the Azure wire server. You may have used the virtual IP 168.63.129.16 before. That does a lot of heavy lifting in your Azure virtual network infrastructure. Now, that's easy when you're within Azure. So if we were on this machine right here, we could make a call to our storage account using its public DNS name. And because the Azure provided DNS is aware that there's a private endpoint there, and most likely when you created the private endpoint, you created a private DNS zone to store that private IP to public DNS name record. Excuse me. Azure provided DNS can do that resolution for you really easily. The catch, or the challenge, I should say, is in a hybrid cloud scenario. Even if you have a site-to-site VPN, the catch here is that your on-premises systems are going to need to address to query this Azure provided DNS resolver. I mean, you could go with a hosts file or something. I mean, it works. But the more elegant solution is to use a service called, let me see if I can remember, I believe it's called Azure DNS Private Resolver. There it is. I put it on the slide. What do you know about that? And this is a platform as a service product that simplifies that name to address translation, particularly in a hybrid cloud. You still have to do a little work with DNS forwarding, specifically conditional forwarding. So on-prem, you would create a conditional forwarding such that if you were trying to call blob.core.windows.net, you would forward to the Azure DNS private resolver in your hub virtual network, and it knows how to talk to the Azure wire server, and then it can then look up the private IP in your private DNS zone, and you're good to go. Again, I'm happy to do a demo on that a little bit later if that's okay. Now, a question I see in the chat from Mamo, is there an Azure service that's not recommended for private endpoint? Well, not every Azure service supports private endpoint. It's actually a good question. Let me see if I can get rid of these floating meeting controls here. Here we are in the Azure portal, and let me go to the private link center. There's actually more to the private endpoint than just the private endpoints. You can actually have a load balanced service like an AKS cluster, and you can put that into, you can create private connections to that using private endpoint as well. That's called a private service or a private link service. If I go to private endpoints and go to create, that'll show us the services that currently support private link. First, we're going to have to specify subscription, our resource group. I'll just call this test link. Notice that you are going to get a software network interface, like I mentioned before. Of course, you'll want to put the private endpoint, and you'll have to put the private endpoint in the same Azure region as the virtual network that you're going to land it in. So next, if we go to resource, let's see what we've got here under resource type. The list is rapidly expanding. It's predominantly data services because look at it. I mean, if anything in Azure, what are you going to be most concerned with accessing privately? It's going to be a database, isn't it, in all likelihood? So we've got Cosmos DB, we've got Azure Bot Service. So any entry point where you're thinking about customer data, that's going to be a service that, like Redis Cache in Azure. So the list has gotten a lot bigger than the last time I was in here. So it's, to me anyway, it's not a question so much of a service that's not recommended. It's making sure that the Azure service supports private endpoints. And nowadays, if it's a data service anyway, the chances are it will. What's the story with Azure Policy? What's going on with that? Are you using Azure Policy at all? Think of it this way. How can we prevent colleagues in our business from deploying virtual machines that are too big, Godzilla-sized? How can we prevent them from deploying VMs that are not configured according to our standards? You may need them to be onboarded into log analytics. Colleague X forgets, colleague Y remembers, inconsistency. What if you have a naming convention to enforce? What if you have taxonomic tags that you need for cost management? You're getting inconsistency there. What if you've got colleagues deploying to the wrong regions? Basically, any Azure pain point, chances are really good you can address it with Azure Policy. So this is why I identify policy as a crucial trend in 2023, because this really will form the heart of your governance strategy. This is a pretty technical diagram. I don't know why I selected it, but essentially what we've got with Azure Policy, I might as well just again kick this over into the portal and show rather than tell. Let's go back into the portal and just go to the policy blade for a second. What you've got at base with Azure Policy is a library of these JSON definitions. And the Microsoft engineers have hundreds and hundreds of built-in definitions, many of which are aligned to the most common compliance certifications. In fact, that's a huge use case for Azure policies, businesses that have to certify with such and so compliance. And this is, if you have a policy initiative already aligned to whatever regulation you're adhering to, it's almost a click once and proceed kind of deal. It's pretty handy. But ultimately, these are individual JSON files. Chances are you'll have more than one individual policy that you want to apply at once. So that's what an initiative is. You can look at an initiative as simply a container that contains one or more policies that you want to manage together as a group, all right? And what these policy definitions instruct Azure Resource Manager to do is whatever it is. There's a hello world example I normally use called allowed locations. Let's take a quick look at that. And this would solve for the question that you've got people deploying to regions that are not allowed based on your compliance. So if we take a look here, we have the policy rule. The Azure Policy Engine, once you assign a policy or an initiative, the team recently, a couple months ago, dramatically lowered the evaluation period. I think it used to be every 30 minutes or every 15 minutes, but now it's something like every 5 minutes. So it's almost like you can assume that your policy engine is always in motion, looking at your resources in your various management scopes, the management group, the subscription, the resource group, and then ultimately the individual resources in your deployments, and testing them against these policy rules. Is the resource compliant or not? And this one says, if all of the following rules evaluate to true, then there's going to be an effect. And there's a number of effects that you can choose from. You could just have policy do a compliance check and then report compliant or not compliant. You could, in this example, deny means that if you try to deploy something in a disallowed region, the deployment's going to fail, period. You see what I mean? There's a very powerful effect called deploy if not exists, or DINE for short. And that's where you can attach an ARM template. Let's say you deployed a policy definition that says that this web app, this Azure App Service web app, needs to be here and it needs to be configured such and so a way. One of your colleagues deletes it thinking it's an artifact left over from testing or something. Well, it's going to be within minutes that that resource that is non-existent now is going to fail compliance validation here. And if you've got deploy if not exists, policy will actually execute an ARM template deployment to resurrect, or technically to recreate that resource. So you can think of Azure Policy as a one-stop shop for governance, for putting guardrails around your environment, and also configuration management, because related to this little mini discussion on Azure Policy is something that it's bound to cause some confusion, because let's face it, at Microsoft, we love to rename services. What we've got is what's called Azure Auto Manage Machine Configuration. The docs are pretty thin, admittedly now, because it's still a new service. Again, big picture trends. When you're thinking about configuration management of your virtual machines, there's stuff like I just showed you, where you can use Azure Policy to prevent a VM from being deployed, or to report it as being non-compliant. But you can now go inside the VM, just like you could over the last several years with PowerShell desired state configuration, if you're familiar with DSC at all. Like, let's say within a Windows Server VM, you've got an IIS web server. One of your colleagues decides to root it out because, oh, we don't need this. Well, you actually do. With DSC, again, it's a similar routine where you scan for compliance and you can auto apply or bring that machine back into its desired state. Well, the analog to that in Azure Policy, it used to be called Azure Policy Machine Configuration. Now it's called Azure Auto Manage Machine Configuration, but you might want to keep your eye on this if you have familiarity with DSC, because, you know, Microsoft is gradually separating it out. In fact, now the latest builds of PowerShell don't even include the DSC bits. So again, speaking of big picture trends, we're seeing, or I'm seeing, a trend away from PowerShell DSC and more into this Azure Auto Manage, where you're using Azure Policy to deploy basically what are DSC configurations. So again, I want to calibrate and not go too deep in the interest of time, but that's something I'd like you to note as far as configuration management in Azure. So speaking of configuration management, what is Azure Arc? Should you care? Well, Azure Arc has as a representative user story, how can we centralize our configuration management? Let's say for our machines. How can we centralize our governance? This Azure Policy looks awesome. Is there any way for us to do that kind of evaluation for, say, our Amazon EC2 virtual machines or our on-premises servers? Well, guess what? Absolutely, there is. Yep. And that is really Azure Arc for servers in a nutshell. So the idea behind Azure Arc, again, there's more than one workload supported. The one I have the most experience with myself is Azure Arc for servers. And the idea here is that you can take your machines, whether they're native Azure VMs, whether they're running in another vendor's cloud, whether they're on premises, whether they're Windows Server or Linux. You can manage them centrally within Azure, because the way the workflow works with Azure Arc for servers is that you onboard that off-cloud machine. You could run a PowerShell script. You can manually install the agent. It's just simply an agent that you install. It uses internet and firewall-friendly protocols, so there's no need for a VPN or an express route circuit. And that off-cloud machine becomes a resource in your Azure subscriptions. What's the benefit of that? Now that you've got that off-cloud machine enrolled in Azure Arc, you can surface compliance, security recommendations, insights, all the goodness that we have natively in ARM, like Azure Monitor with log analytics, Azure Policy. You can get AI based suggestions from Defender products. You've got your security SIM SOAR stuff with Microsoft Sentinel. So there's, to my mind, a lot of value here that goes far beyond what you might be used to on-prem with, say, just the System Center products themselves. So that's pretty cool, in my opinion. You can service your off-cloud machines by using the Azure VM extension model. So if you want to do a programmatic installation or something, you can fire off a shell script or a PowerShell script from Azure using the extension model. And it doesn't matter where the VM is, like I said, whether it's in Azure natively, in another cloud, or on premises. Pretty cool. Snagit keeps injecting itself into my life here. Now, I mentioned that Azure Arc is a bigger product. It's more than just Azure Arc for servers. There's a couple other workloads that are also supported, like Kubernetes here. Azure Arc for Kubernetes allows you to take your clusters that, again, may be in Google Cloud or Amazon, or if you're living dangerously and you're managing clusters on-prem, you can represent those in Azure and manage them centrally from within Azure and apply governance with Azure policy and all of that good stuff. So I would strongly recommend you take a good, long, hard look at Azure Arc, particularly Azure Arc for servers. Now, my favorite trend, and it's certainly getting a lot of play in the news nowadays, is AI and Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI specifically. What's the user story here? How can we save time, effort, and money by leveraging pre-created AI models in our workloads? Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? What the heck is an AI model? Well, again, calibrating for time. The way I would describe an artificial intelligence model is where you combine your source data related to whatever workload it is that you're solving for. You've got one or more statistical algorithms that are intended to look for patterns in that data. And then you've got compute to tie that all together and grind out and train up a model that then can be used to either make predictions with new data that it hasn't seen yet, or do some kind of classification, make some kind of recommendation. What a great thing. I'm a huge fan. Obviously, there's cautions and concerns with all of this, but man, just as a top line point, it's so impressive. So this slide just mentions a whole bunch of services, not just within Azure, but across the Microsoft Cloud platform. Like Power in the upper left, you've got some of the Power platform, like Power Apps and Power Automate and Power BI. They all integrate into AI services. Office 365, from what I've heard, we're at Microsoft, we're gradually integrating ChatGPT and some of the open AI stuff into the Office apps. Let's see, in the lower right, there's a whole blistering array of various Microsoft 365 Defender products. Defender for Endpoint, a nice cloud-based solution for hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, anti-malware, and not just the old school anti-spyware, anti-malware, but predictive analytics. You know, based on behavior I'm seeing on your laptop, you might want to do this and that. I mean, it's really big value, it seems to me. Being able to inventory all of the software right down to the driver level on your machines and say, you know what, you've got an older Python version and you've got a package there that has a known CVE vulnerability. You might want to do something about that. This is good, because think of how many of us in IT, or how many plates we're spinning normally on a daily basis. Ain't nobody, it's not that ain't nobody got time for that. It's, well, it is. You can't do everything. So if you can leverage some artificial intelligence models, particularly ones that you haven't had to train yourself, that's really the value prop that I want to bring to the table. That with this Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI, we don't have to worry about creating the model from scratch to give us, say, cost optimization recommendations. ChatGPT is part of the OpenAI family. The Azure Machine Learning Service, you may have heard of that. That is where you want to or need to roll your own, so to speak. So if I go back into the portal, you absolutely have a central interface for building, training, retraining, updating, hosting, maintaining, monitoring your own models from scratch. There's a whole collection of pre-created models, the cognitive services. Again, the value prop here is that just an example off the top of my head. Let's say that you for some reason, you're glutton for punishment. You're going to do an HR human resources app, and you want to give people the ability to easily scan receipts. I know it's Mickey Mouse nowadays because you can do that on your phone pretty trivially, but that would be an example where you can leverage a cognitive service and you don't have to worry about anything with the model. You're just consuming the model as it's already not only been developed and trained, but it's constantly being improved, you see. All right, so what else did I want to show here? Power Platform, are you familiar with that at all? I didn't include Power Platform as a trend as such. It was kind of on the fence. The idea, if you don't know, with Power Platform, it's a collection of cloud-based tools that are meant to empower the so-called citizen developer. So with Power Automate, you can create business workflows, like if this, then that. A marketing department may want to look out on Twitter for mentions of your company name. You can do that easily with Power Automate without having to know anything about REST API development. Now, where things get kicked up a notch is where you can tie in some AI services. It's called, in the Power Platform, it's called, what is it called? AI Builder, I believe is what it's called. All it is are entry points into the various Microsoft cognitive services. So we could really kick up a Power Automate flow to not only look on Twitter 24 hours a day if anybody mentions our company names or products, but we can then tap into AI Builder and run a sentiment analysis. And if the sentiment is negative, we could branch and notify these people and take these actions. If the sentiment is positive, we could do something else. You see what I mean? Similarly, for that example I gave of reading receipts and digitizing that kind of stuff, we could create a Power App, which are basically internal use mobile apps that are meant to run on a phone or a mobile device like a tablet. And you can layer in artificial intelligence in an almost turnkey fashion with that. Now, if you're thinking, as I'm hoping you are in a way, what's all this chat GPT stuff? It's in the news all the time. And then thinking about the busy IT professional and the scary times, I'm hoping that you've been wanting to know a bit more about those services, but you just haven't blacked out the time yet. So just in a couple minutes, I want to give you a flying head start on that, because I really do think it's so important with implications in Azure all over the place. That Chat GPT is one of the services that OpenAI offers, and it is a chatbot. So if you want to get started right now and just kick the tires, there's no charge at this point. None of the OpenAI services have a cost associated with them. Point your browser to chat.openai.com. You do have to sign in. I just use my Google ID. And then we've got this interface, and notice it keeps a record of previous questions I've asked it. We can clear out the questions. And what's neat is that my daughter does some pretty interesting stuff with her story writing and art, but we in tech can also leverage this. I mean, you can use it for knowledge discovery and exploration. What is the AI Builder in Microsoft Power Platform? So using natural language, we can submit any question to ChatGPT. And based on its data set, its source data set, it's coming back. I've never had it not give me a coherent answer to a question that I've had. And of course, some of the things that I wish we had the time and scope to discuss are, and one thing that's very interesting to me is detecting plagiarism and how can we limit abuse with something like this? Because you could very easily, it seems to me, write a technical paper or a report just simply by querying ChatGPT. Now, as far as the code stuff goes, let's say you're working in Azure and you're doing stuff with Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. Maybe you're a developer and you're using C# or Java or Python, and you need to get smart quickly in Azure. There's another, it's called the Codex model. If you point your browser, actually it's kind of a long URL. If you do a Google search for OpenAI Playground, it'll take you into this interface. And again, sign in with your Google account. It's free. And make sure that you're using the Codex model. The suggested one is called Codex Da Vinci. And you can just give it some kind of comment syntax here. Create a PowerShell script to create an Azure AD user account. And then we submit that. Codex is optimized for code generation. Now, it's not perfect. This one is kind of freaking out on me, unfortunately. Let me see if I can clear that out. I wish it didn't do that. No, didn't like that at all. Let me just try in plain language. Create an Azure AD user account with Azure CLI. Come on. I hate when demos blow up like this. Normally, you see some pretty amazing stuff going on in here. I mean, it doesn't have to be PowerShell or the Azure CLI. I'm not sure. It went left instead of right. Lastly, just to wrap this little mini demo up, I want to make sure that you're aware of GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot uses a customized version of the OpenAI Codex. And it is a paid service. It costs, there's a 60-day trial. It costs, I think, $10 USD a month, $100 a year. And what you do is go to github.com and sign up for Copilot and then install the extension in VS Code, which I've done, as you can see here. Let me hide the meeting controls. And then the way it works, there's a couple ways to invoke its recommendations. What it's doing, it's meant to be an AI-powered pair programmer. And so based on your environment, that is, Copilot will look in your directory. And if you've got a variable named foo in another file, it can actually include that variable in the code that it generates for you. It can be scary sometimes. So let me, in this PS1 file, use a comment syntax again. Let me try what I did over in the playground. Create an Azure AD user account. And I can do, it's either Control Enter or Shift Enter. It's Control Enter. And you see that it will synthesize up to 10 solutions. Now, it's using open source code, and it's not doing direct copy paste. It's actually synthesizing new code based on existing code that it's been trained with. And so you can look through the different examples, and when you find one that you like, you can hit that accept solution, and it brings it over here into your workspace. Another thing you can do, and then I promise we'll continue, is as you're actually coding, watch this. If I do function create Azure AD user, and then if I open that up with a paren and just pause, notice that within a couple seconds, GitHub Copilot has given me a suggestion. And there's some keyboard shortcuts that you can use. You can, I think it's Alt with square brackets, or is it Control? I guess maybe it's Alt. There we go. I'm doing Alt closed square brackets, and it'll go through different examples. And then you could either press Escape to dismiss or press Tab to commit that change. So that's just some quick examples of how AI services have become so easily consumable. And particularly with that GitHub Copilot, your work in Azure, it can really accelerate things because you're not having to go to Stack Overflow every 5 minutes to get sample code. You can literally just create a function with a name that's meaningful, and a lot of the code, boom, suddenly shows up. Now, of course, there's no guarantees. You have to make sure that the code does what you need it to do. It's not magic after all. Anyway, let me see. Any outstanding questions? Looks like Ginny has a question from Azure Policy. Is there any possibility of having duplicate policies with the same definitions? Yes, there is, because you can in fact layer Azure Policy. That is, you could have a policy happening up at the management group scope that's going to flow down through all your subscriptions. And then you might have one at the resource group level that either conflicts or overlaps, or to your point, Jenny, it could be the same one. Let me see. Offhand, is there a quick way to fix that kind of problem? Out of box, I'm not thinking of anything out of box right offhand, but I'll tell you what, I know that in the docs, there's a good article that talks about layering Azure policy. Let's see. It's in one of these. Let me make a note. I put my Twitter handle, Tech Trainer Tim, in the chat earlier. What I'm going to do is I'll do some research tomorrow morning when I get to my office, and I'll ask some of my colleagues on the policy team what they think. Let me quickly create a sticky note on my desktop so I don't forget. And I will post that result on Twitter tomorrow, all right? So be on the lookout. Let me see. Ask team how to detect and prevent duplicate policies. Well, there are processing rules, and it's in one of these articles. I'm disappointed that it's not popping right up here. Let me, it might be this policy effects. Let me see. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So in the article, Understand Azure Policy Effects, after it discusses each effect, there's a bit on layering policy where it shows the precedence rules. Yeah, Frank, you're funny. Frank in the chat is saying, what is Chat GPT? You know, you're absolutely right. Seriously. Wow, that's funny. So let me say, how can I detect duplicate Azure policy assignments in my subscriptions? I think, have we stumped it? Uh-oh, this is freaking me out here. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot there, isn't it? It's showing the different methods. Includes several built-ins that can detect duplicate assignments. I'll have to dig into that. But certainly you could use something like an automation script to look for duplicates. I can see that, but I was hoping for more of a turnkey option. Interesting. Learn something new every day. Okay, so what's next? How about Microsoft deployment services trends? How can we adopt an infrastructure as code workflow in Azure? Painful question for you. How many of you are part of a Scrum or Agile team? How many of you are part of a DevOps group? How many of you are using platforms like GitHub or Azure DevOps to do continuous integration, continuous delivery? Of course, we could list some of the benefits of infrastructure as code. Let's assume that we're doing that. That is, we have our Azure deployments codified in JSON templates. How can we do that better? What are the trends looking like for 2023? Well, one, I hope that you'll consider this idea of CI/CD. And what I sometimes hear described as GitOps. The idea that in your source code, you have not only, if you're doing a mono repo, for instance, you not only have your application source code, but you also have your infrastructure as code. So if your application runs on AKS, your AKS cluster and its associated resources were deployed via a template, not through hand clicking in the portal. Benefits there are of so many. Any change we make to the environment going forward is going to be tracked in Git. And we can automate the testing and deployment of all of that by using services like Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions, you see. So that would be one trend to continue thinking about and maybe take action. But then specifically in Azure, there are the means by which we deploy those resources, Bicep being a chief one. In fact, I'm pretty sure I gave a talk for the Nashville Azure group several months ago on using Bicep. It's certainly well in the MS docs. And as I mentioned, the ARM template nowadays, the ARM template reference, let me again jump out into demo here. If you hear my dog barking in the background, I'm sorry about that. He's a corgi. They're pretty verbose animals. He's growling and playing. What was I going to look for? Oh, yeah, the Azure ARM template reference. Hey, Sue, could you quiet the dogs down, please? Thanks. Okay. Yeah, so now you see, instead of just being called the Azure Resource Manager template reference, now it's Bicep, ARM, and Terraform. I mean, I just am tickled with this so much. Well, I've been a Microsoft specialist since 1997 or so, and the idea of first-party company like Microsoft hosting Terraform in its reference is just, it's wonderful. And I'm going to be snarky, snark alert. I don't think you'd see Amazon do this ever. So yeah, so here's Bicep, and normally you look up a resource and there's normally a tabbed interface where it shows the JSON, it shows the Bicep, and then we also have the HashiCorp configuration language for Terraform templates as well. Yeah, so that's fine. That's all well and good. But here's what I alluded to at the start of the presentation that you might not know about, and it's definitely something I'd like you to keep your eye on in 2023. If you're familiar at all with Azure Blueprints, does that ring a bell with anybody? Again, this Zoom thing is getting on my nerves. Let me go into the portal. Let me go to Blueprints to set the stage here. Blueprints is a great idea that really never took off. What you've got with Blueprints, it's basically a way to make it easier to do a complex deployment. You know, with ARM JSON, let's face it, if you've worked with ARM JSON templates, they're not the most fun thing to work in. Specifically, if you've got more complex deployments, you've got the idea of linked templates. We could look at Blueprints as a way to abstract some of that complexity. So if we need to deploy a VNet and some virtual machines, we need to do some Azure policy assignments and some role-based access control. You can put all of that together. You can compose a blueprint definition and then assign that blueprint. And then again, going forward, whenever you need to maintain that environment, you do it in the blueprint source and republish your changes. So it's all very DevOpsy, it's all very current generation. Never took off for various reasons. So what I need you to understand is that if you're thinking of adopting Blueprints, please don't. It's not formally deprecated, but it's absolutely informally deprecated. And eventually it will go away. I mean, in Azure, we have rules as far as like retiring services, and it's normally years, not months, but years, in order not to hurt customers who have adopted that. I mean, you can look and find some really dinosaur stuff going on in Azure. I mean, look for Classic, for instance, you know. So what is replacing Blueprints? There's two things that are replacing Blueprints. One is template specs. And template specs, this is a way to take a Bicep or an ARM JSON template, store it in your Azure subscription, and have it serve basically as a template. Just like in Microsoft Word, you have an invoice template, something like that. And the beauty here is that your colleagues don't have to have access to the actual source, the JSON. All you need in Azure is read access in order to do a deployment based on the template spec. So you would normally, the best practice would be to combine using infrastructure as code and CI/CD. You would author the Bicep template, however you normally do, put it into source code control, build and create a template spec, and then anybody or any process or service principal or whatever needs is read on that template spec in order to use it, you see? So that is one half of what's replacing the Bicep. And template specs can do it all. They can do infrastructure deployments. They can do Azure policy assignments and RBAC, just like you can in Blueprints. The other thing, it's not in the portal yet because it's still in early days, is a service called Deployment Stacks. I'm intimately involved in that project daily now. And they cleared me. I'm not disclosing any NDA. They want customers to use it, even though it's in private preview. Actually, hit me up on Twitter if you're interested in testing it, because I'll connect you to the team. What is a deployment stack? Well, if you've seen stacks in AWS, it's a similar idea, and it does the lion's share of what Azure Blueprints does. And the best practice is that you combine Bicep to create your template, the template spec to be your deployable unit, and then your deployment stack to be your actual deployment. You see? So you start with your template, make it a spec, and then you create your deployment stack by bringing in those template specs. So maybe you've got one spec to create a hub spoke VNet infrastructure, another spec to create some virtual machines, another spec to do a database, whatever. You create your deployment stack by bringing those templates in, and now you can organize and maintain them as a unit by modifying and redeploying the stack. Lastly, the stack offers locking just like Blueprints does. In other words, let's say we create a stack that deploys a hub and spoke network architecture. You then can put a lock on it to make sure that if one of your colleagues comes by and wants to create a new subnet and you don't want any changes to that environment outside of canonically in your stack, very easy to do with a lock. So that in a nutshell is the next generation of what was Azure Blueprints, and it's the next generation of Microsoft Azure deployment. Again, it's Bicep as the domain-specific template language. Template specs is your way to represent and give access to those deployment templates, and then wrap them all together using deployment stacks. All righty, any questions about that? Jeremy, thanks for that heads up about Bicep. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the customer pickup on some Azure services is so overwhelming, and Bicep is a great example of that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So let me come back to the slide deck. So what do we have next? Hybrid cloud identity, the last trend. What's going on here? How can we give our local users, particularly imagine you're a local Active Directory shop, single sign-on or SSO, not only into Azure, but to our line of business SaaS applications. You know the drill. The more credentials somebody has, the more attack and exposure surface there is per user. So how can we reuse a single well-protected credential instead of having credential bloat? So this is a big subject, obviously. Hybrid identity in Azure Active Directory. What are some of the parts and pieces we can layer? And this isn't the best example, like I say. So let me again come back into demo land and let's go to, you know what I'm going to do? Again, speaking of trends, I was going to go in here in the portal and just go to the Azure Active Directory blade, but I want to do one better and go to entra.microsoft.com. I think that's the URL. And I'll sign in with my Azure AD account. Entra.microsoft.com. This is the new home of Azure Active Directory. Do you have to use it? No. You can still access your Azure Active Directory tenant from within the Azure portal or using Azure PowerShell or an SDK or within Microsoft 365. It's just that the Entra Admin Center gives you not just access to Azure AD, but the UI is revamped. Let me zoom out. Why am I not seeing anything? Uh-oh, what in the world is going on here? Let me do a hard refresh. That's never good. It organizes the tools a lot better than what you see in the Azure portal. For instance, if you're looking for stuff like privileged identity management, identity protection, those sorts of things, they're surfaced much more front and center in Entra. Here we go. Yeah. So we've got Azure AD. So this is a UI interface for Azure AD. But notice that the idea with this left-hand navigation in the Entra Admin Center is that we can expect to see future Microsoft Cloud Platform identity services layer in here as well. And just because they're here, I'll mention them in passing. There's what's called Entra Permissions Management, or EPM. It's wanting to log in, so I'm going to bomb out of that. What EPM is in a nutshell, it does some of the same stuff that you have with privileged identity management, to where you have a need to see who are my privileged users, Are there any orphaned users that have too much permissions? It's a pretty cool service that's baked into Azure AD Premium. But this Entra Permissions Management, I think, is super impressive. It's actually an acquisition Microsoft made of a company called, the name's escaping me now. If we click out to it, CloudKnox is what it is. Yeah, CloudKnox. But what it allows you to do, among some other things, is not only granular report, okay, we've got this user, they have these RBAC assignments, and this is their scope of authorization in the subscription, let's say. That's something we can do in Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. What permissions management does, it actually can show you what they're actually using in their scope of RBAC. And then you could say, okay, I'm giving them this level of access, but they're only using these operations. Let me create a custom role that uses just this, so you can right size your RBAC permissions. Isn't that awesome? Yeah, permissions management's pretty darn cool. And then lastly, in passing, verified ID is the notion of, what do they call it? Let me see if the marketing text here lights up. They're digital credentials, and it's meant to be a way for users to have more privacy when they need to show ID. And an example I give when I teach this, for example, is let's say that, you know, a university decides to buy into verified ID. They would create, similar to how you would have a public digital certificate to represent your organization, you would start to stamp out verified IDs for, say, the faculty, staff, and students of your university. The users will keep that digital ID in Microsoft Authenticator on their phones. And then they can redeem, or if they need to show that verified ID, let's say they walk into the university bookstore and they need, in order to get their discount, they have to show that they're a part of the university. The idea is that they're not going to take out a physical card that might have extra info that's not relevant to the person looking at the card. That's the privacy aspect. It puts a lot more control in the user's hands. The user would have to approve the authentication request, and you have some control over what fields are shared. It's pretty slick. It's pretty cool. I don't know too many folks who are using it at this point, but anyway, it's something to consider because we are on the subject of trends in Azure. Let's see, looks like we're just about at the top of the hour. Bill, are there any questions in the chat that might have slid by that I missed? Or does anybody want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, I don't think so. Jeremy had a comment about bicep and training and GitHub Actions, but no questions that I can see.
Okay. Yeah, the MS Learn training library has, in fact, again, it's timely for me because I'm actually working on those paths right now, as a matter of fact. If we go to, let me see, how could we find it easily enough? Bicep, Microsoft Learn path.
Yeah.
You can really go all in learning Bicep for free just by going to learn.microsoft.com/training. There's there's 5 paths. There's fundamentals, intermediate, advanced Bicep, and then there's paths, as Jeremy's mentioning, for GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps. They are really well done. A friend of mine named John Downs from New Zealand is the primary author. Fantastic guy, did a great job on this.
And from someone who's done a lot of work with ARM templates, I really love Bicep.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, JSON is a data serialization format. It's not a programming language. And Microsoft, I like to describe as hijacked or co-opted the use of JSON to shoehorn it as a programming or DSL, a domain-specific language. Bicep, in my opinion, is so intelligently designed because the engineers specifically took cues from a little bit of JavaScript, a lot of HashiCorp, the Terraform DSL. They took what customers are actually using now and integrated all of that into the Bicep language. And the goal there, of course, is to make the language as familiar as possible so that you can quickly get ramped up. Now, Michael, I'm glad you asked that question. In chat, Michael mentioned, is Bicep replacing ARM? No, not at all. It's critically important that you understand, first of all, Azure Resource Manager is the control plane across all of Azure. It's the deployment engine across Azure, across the whole board, and it's a REST API. As a REST API, ARM expects when it receives instructions like a deployment template, it expects JSON. So that JSON is never going away. What Bicep is, it's a domain-specific language, not exactly a programming language, not exactly maybe I'd call it a configuration language, that you use this consistent syntax to create your deployments. And then when you do your deployment of the Bicep file under the hood, your tooling will transpile your Bicep file into JSON. Because like I said, it is always JSON that goes into ARM. When you install the Bicep tools on your workstation, you'll have access to the Bicep command line interface, and you can do Bicep build to manually transpile from Bicep to JSON. You can also do Bicep decompile to do the opposite. That would be good for businesses who currently have JSON templates and you want to quickly get a Bicep representation. You can do Bicep decompile, boom, and now you've got a Bicep representation of your previous JSON. Peter's mentioning another trend. I probably should have included the GitHub versus Azure DevOps as a trend. Thanks for surfacing, Peter. The question is Microsoft moving away from Azure DevOps? Because let's face it, Microsoft owns both GitHub and Azure DevOps. Are they moving away? Yes and no. Here's the deal to the extent of NDA information. Okay, so on one hand, we've got Azure DevOps. This is a cloud-based collection of tools that support software development, CI/CD, DevOps, Agile, Scrum, whatever, you name it. On the other hand, we've now got GitHub. Still to this day in 2023, I would say there's a big gap between ADO and GitHub. Microsoft is prioritizing new development and innovation at GitHub. Why? For two reasons. One, Microsoft has a huge goal of bringing GitHub into full feature parity and beyond of Azure DevOps. That's still probably years off, but that's the goal. Once they've reached feature parity and then GitHub starts going beyond, then I would say ADO would start to be de-emphasized more and more. But there is nothing, not even a hint of the D word, deprecation, with ADO. I mean, it's public knowledge, I think you'd expect, because Microsoft is a dog fooding company. We use ADO all the time. All the Azure resource provider teams are all in ADO. I mean, using it internally, heavily internally, customers around the world using Azure DevOps internally. So no. So what I normally suggest people do if they're looking to adopt one, the other, or both of these platforms, is if you're looking for a solution that's all ready to go and already cohesive and already fully featured and extensible with some warts, there's Azure DevOps. GitHub, for what it does, especially the code stuff and GitHub Actions is nice nowadays. There's GitHub packages there. I mean, it is coming into feature parity, but it's not quite there yet. So chances are very good that you're going to have dependencies on other tools along with GitHub. So that's what I normally say. In practice, in my work at Microsoft, I'm in them both pretty equally, honestly. And I would imagine that's probably reflective of a lot of businesses around the world nowadays. And again, Peter's following up. Certainly, Microsoft is going to have, again, and understand, I'm not speaking for Microsoft. This is just purely my own educated, I don't want to say speculation, because that sounds cheap, educated insights, I guess, for lack of a better term. Absolutely, there'll be a path. I mean, I can give you a cut down example of what we're talking about. Remember, I mentioned a little while ago that we've got blueprints that are definitely going the way of the dodo. I think Microsoft could do a much better job about the messaging on that, honestly. That's something that I'm evangelizing myself. but it is going the way of the dodo to where Microsoft cloud solution architects tell their customers, don't use Bicep. Focus on template specs and deployment stacks. I'm working with the deployment stacks team right now on those migration paths. It's top of mind for these engineering teams because, you know, we've got customers who are using blueprints. How can we give them the most pain-free or low-pain path? I would bet my life just about that if and when the day comes where Microsoft is looking at retiring or sunsetting or slowly deprecating Azure DevOps, there's going to be a very nice migration path for customers. Because remember, Microsoft, a company with over 200,000 employees, using it internally every day, they're going to be dog fooding the heck out of their own migration path. So I hope that gives you some hope. Other questions, comments, concerns, curiosities?
There was one question which you won't be able to answer, which is, which approach should we take, Bicep, Terraform, or ARM templates? Well, we know about the ARM templates, but the question is always, should we be using Terraform? Should we be using Bicep?
Well, what I normally will come back with initially is, are you currently multi-cloud? Will you be, or do you expect to become multi-cloud? One, probably the Achilles heel of Bicep is the fact that it's Azure only. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, value proposition of HashiCorp Terraform is that it's multi-cloud by default. And you know, to that point, a weakness historically of Terraform has been that you normally have to wait a while when a new Azure service comes out of preview before there's provider support in Terraform. Microsoft and Terraform are kind of BFFs now. So there's actually a couple providers available for Terraform and Azure now, including one that allows you to bring in preview features. So that delay that historically was a pain point with Terraform is much, much less of a problem now. So I would say that if you're multi-cloud, you're tending toward multi-cloud, and you really want to choose kind of instead of a both and an either or approach, then I think Terraform would be a clear winner in that regard. I don't know for sure, but I'm thinking that it's possible that someday Bicep may be multi-cloud aware and may have a provider model similar to how Terraform does. I don't know. It's certainly not the case now. If you're strictly within Azure, then I would say, again, it would be a question of comfortability. Bicep does have the nearest and closest and highest fidelity access to the ARM APIs, and that should make total sense because it's a Microsoft property. So if you are a Microsoft shop, you can absolutely still go with Terraform, but you're going to have the best fidelity experience by using Bicep. Thank you, Rajesh. So I see a question from D. Pollard, Bill. Any thoughts on companies moving to IAC or infrastructure as code platforms for catalog self-service like Terraform Cloud? And, you know, I'm not really, D. Pollard, if you wouldn't mind adding a little more context to your question. I'm not 100% clear on what you mean by that. And while I'm waiting, if you do choose to respond, let me wrap up my summary slide here for you. So I'm saying dive into these Azure services ASAP, because I submit that being on the front end of this stuff, these trends in 2023 can do nothing but help you deliver more value to your company, to your clients, your customers. And also, frankly, from a career perspective, a good way to future-proof your career as much as that's possible in these volatile times. So again, the session materials are timw.info/aztrends, and there's my Twitter handle again. And I do have that outstanding question that I'll research tomorrow. Although ChatGPT gave us a nice answer to that question on how to detect and prevent duplicate Azure policy assignments. Yeah, would you come off mute, D. Pollard? I'd love to hear your context.
Yeah, sure. Tim, first of all, thank you very much. Great presentation and some really good trends there. Yeah, kind of talking about some companies I speak to moving away from providing access to either like direct to pipelines or direct to like the portal. They want to give like a catalog of things to deploy, an entire dev environment where a developer or someone who just wanted to go kick on something for a little bit can go ahead, go to these self-service platforms that have policies and all the code and all that could be hooked into the back end, like infrastructure, like Terraform Cloud or like Scalar, N0. All those is trying to give that better developer experience while still having like all the ops stuff like kind of built in. I'm just wondering if Microsoft's kind of thinking about or moving towards that kind of self-service type of menu, because that's one thing I see lacking in both ADO and GitHub and just about everyone else except for these specialized third parties. And if you want to spend $1 billion with Terraform Cloud to get that. So just kind of curious your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I think that is a pain point in the Azure cloud and the Microsoft cloud specifically. Let me see. I think it's called the service catalog. If you have an enterprise agreement or whatever the current name for that model is, you can advertise some services and hide others, but that's not specifically what you're talking about. There was a service called Azure Dev Test Labs where you could create environment templates and have more governance and control. I'm not even sure if that's still around, but you're right. It is a weak point. I'll mention that to the deployment team tomorrow. Let me add another thing to research and put on Twitter. So I'll ask this and say, because what I'm thinking is what I mentioned earlier about deployment stacks, I can see that potentially having a self-service capability because, like I said, with those template specs, the calling processor user just needs read. So there's no concern of having somebody mess with the source of your infrastructure as code. And the deployment stacks have a lot of layers of protection and abstraction. So could deployment stacks or another service offer self-service capabilities like Terraform Cloud? Yeah, so that's the best I got for you. I'll see what I can do to gain some more intelligence tomorrow. Yeah. Well, that's all I got. There's my contact deets. I want to thank you again for having me. It's always fun to talk shop.
Thanks,
Bill?
Tim. Another great presentation. And for those of you who want more Azure, we'll see you next month.
See you, everybody.
Goodbye.